Welcome to the Imaginaries.
I'm here with Tony, my co-host, and we are going to be talking today about politics. There's no better time than the present. As you might be aware, we are in a rather tumultuous political climate ourselves in the real non-SF world. So today we decided we're going to take the opportunity to talk about politics in science fiction. And to start us off, I think it would be worth establishing the boundaries of the definition of politics. So for the duration of today's podcast, we're going to be talking about politics in terms of 4 guiding stars. And those guiding stars are borders, identities, governance, and the future of the state. Now, I am inspired in part by an article I read earlier today. This article was by Isabella Herman and appeared on munplanet.com. If that sounds suspicious, it probably is. I don't know. But the article was fantastic, and it was called What Science Fiction Movies Can Tell Us About World Politics. And as I was reading this article, I was thinking, wow, she has some really fantastic points about the stakes of politics in science fiction, what they mean to us as readers and what they mean to the worlds being described. So we're going to use those 4 guiding stars pulled from her article as a starting point for our discussion today. And Tony, you have some other guiding stars for us. What are they?
Yeah, so what I would like to do is, before we get too deeply into multiple meanings of politics, I'd like to talk about politics as governance as enacted by science fiction and fantasy. And to do that, I'd like to think about 6 representative books and or book series that really exemplify some of the systems of government, some of the systems of governance and politics that I've seen many, many times in science fiction and fantasy.
So these are sort of symbolic texts in a way. They're standing in for greater numbers of science fiction texts.
Yeah, I would say that the systems of governance in these books are not archetypal exactly, but are definitely indicative of different modes in science fiction and fantasy, both in textual form and on screens and in comics and in video games. You see these sorts of systems a lot. I don't think that they're the only 6 systems that exist, but they occur often enough that they're worth mentioning, and I think that these 6 books and or book series do them really well.
And we can, bonus, talk about them in 45 minutes or fewer. So, what are these texts?
All right, so these texts are, in no particular order, the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, The Old Kingdom books by Garth Nix, A Leaf, The Unseen by G. Willow Wilson, and The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin.
So if you're not excited about any of those texts, I apologize greatly, but we're going to be talking about them occasionally throughout this podcast.
And we hope that you're excited about at least one of them.
Absolutely. Okay, so take us back to the top. You wanted to talk about governance first.
I did.
So when you talk about governance, are you talking about the system of government in place or the way in which the people who live in that world deal with politics?
So your question has to do with the enactment of power, the enactment of governmental power versus people's responses to that power.
Exactly. Yes. So give me an example from one of the texts that you brought to the table today. When you're talking about politics in regards to one of these texts, specifically governance, what does that look like?
Yeah, so the examples that I chose really range in governmental forms from post-scarcity utopia in the culture. God, that's not really a system of governance, though. Like, post-scarcity...
I mean, that's larger than any one governmental system as written into the world by the author. It's almost the greater aesthetic of the piece. And that brings me to something else, which is the aesthetic of politics. Like, we all know that there are some science fiction texts out there where the governmental system written into the text or the multiple governmental systems written to the text are more there to give texture to the world than they are to comment upon today's world. And I'm thinking specifically of The Expanse, but there are so many texts in which that's true, where the politics may provide some useful plot devices, but mostly it's there to create a backdrop and a soundstage for what else happens. Do you think that's true of the majority of science fiction texts, or is it just something more typical of what you see on the Sci-Fi Channel?
So if you stay tuned for one of our future podcasts, potentially even in the next week or two, we're going to talk about the second beauty of science fiction, stealing from Chichiri Rone again, the seven beauties of science fiction, and talk about the novum, so the central new idea of a work of science fiction. And so I think you can definitely have those works of science fiction and fantasy in which the system of governance or the people's response to governance or the political situation writ large is in fact the novum, whether that's a new form of governance, whether the government is changing, whether it is the politics themselves, whatever it may be, that could be the novum, that could be the central new thing, the focus of the book or the movie or the show. It isn't necessarily so, and I think that, and I'm not going to back this up with anything other than my own experiences, but I do think that you tend to find politics and government more as a backdrop for works, more so than the focus. And if it is the focus, it tends to be a more secondary focus, and typically a government that is shady or untrustworthy or in some way adversarial, and not really explored beyond that, unless characters belong to the system of governance themselves or are in some way opposed to the system.
And I'm thinking, this is going to an opposite end of the spectrum from something as literary as Station 11, but I'm thinking of a lot of YA series in which you'll see an ascendancy from one relationship with the governmental system. You'll see an ascendance from not being in power to being in power to perhaps deconstructing that government. I'm thinking specifically of The Hunger Games. I'm thinking specifically of Divergent. There's a lot of those texts out there. So that relationship, I feel like, or that series of relationships with politics has been fairly well explored. It's perhaps an easier mode of science fiction to portray than something like Station 11, which could be simply described as a dystopic post-governmental world, but it's way more than that. I would say that Station 11 is a great example of politics as aesthetics working well. Like, the political situation provides a tenor, provides a background to what's going on, but it's not the point. And whatever is the point, the journey of these characters through this landscape, that is so beautifully executed. You don't mind what else is happening in the text. The politics is almost beside the point. It's interesting, but it's beside the point.
Yes, and I like Station 11 because I think it actually operates on multiple levels as far as governance and politics in science fiction is concerned. One of the core reasons that I chose it is that it follows in this mode that goes all the way back to non-science fictional texts, like Lord of the Flies even, when you take a group of people, separate them from the systems that they are accustomed to.
Or are secure in, yeah.
Or are secure in, right. Or are drawing privilege and power from, and take all that away, and then what happens? Station 11, as much as I chose it as an example of politics and governance as a part of this list, I think could be also read as apolitical. Not that Emily St. John Mandel doesn't have things to say about the politics in this book, or things about systems of governance generally, but rather this book, as far as the sections that are set in the future, are kind of sans large political structures, and that's the point. And so it would be shortchanging it to say that this book is solely in the dystopian mode, because it isn't, and not that you're saying that, and not that I'm saying that, but it is doing multiple things, of which that is one, and of which this sans governance is also another one.
Right. It's a simple description to call it dystopic post-governance, but that's not... Simple isn't necessarily bad, and that particular aspect of the text isn't the dominant one in my mind. Whereas, to contrast that to another world in which politics and governance is the entire point, I can't think of a better example than Ian M. Banks' Culture series, which you recommended that I read, and I did read the first book in that series, and it took me a while, and it was intense and very emotional, and perhaps a way that was not connected to the text itself. So tell me a little bit about what you see happening in Culture in terms of governance.
So I want to start with what Ian M. Banks said about Culture himself. So in a piece from 1996, he said, and I quote, that Culture is my personal ideal for a utopian society. So this is nothing less than kind of wish fulfillment. Wish fulfillment is weighted with this non-critical sort of reflection on oneself. So when you fulfill your wishes, you're doing the opposite of reflective work. You're not thinking about what you want. You're not thinking about why you want it. And so I hesitate to call it wish fulfillment because I think that the Culture series is so very thoughtful, not only about what that sort of post-scarcity utopia looks like, but also it's a direct critique of other such utopias that have existed in fiction. I mentioned Culture in response to and in conversation with Star Trek in previous podcasts, and I'll mention that again because Star Trek, in my mind, is very based in, or rather, Star Trek is also an example of a post-scarcity utopian society. However, Star Trek is very much based in 1960s military liberalism. And I don't mean that as a critique per se, but I do mean it as a critical reflection. In a way that Culture is not, all that is followed in Star Trek, whether that's in the subsequent TV series, whether it's in the reboot movies, we'll see if it continues in the new series, Star Trek Discovery, but all of it is necessarily based in this understanding of liberal utopianism from the 60s that's based in kind of the military complex. Like, even though Starfleet and Star Trek is not a military organization, it's paramilitary. It's kind of military. It's there for exploration, but they carry phasers and they have guns on the starships, and they're basically big battleships in space instead of on the sea. So you can't help but make those connections. And that sort of militarism is not directly at odds with the utopian stuff, but I think you can have militaristic utopias or utopian militaries, or however that would actually look. However, I'm getting way off from Culture, so I want to drop Star Trek for a minute because...
You always go off on Star Trek because Star Trek provides so many useful avenues for discussion, specifically about politics. I don't think our discussion of Culture really takes us off base because I think it provides a really handy segue into one of the other four guiding stars of this conversation, which is the future of the state. And Star Trek, I don't know if more than most other science fiction texts, but in line with many other science fiction texts, is very concerned about the future of the state. And this is, dear readers, where we intersect very neatly with our current political situation. Right now, a lot of people are very worried about what the future is going to look like. You see this reflected in advertisements on television, in television shows themselves, in the science fiction being written today that's going to be published in 2 years. You know, you see a lot of that, a lot of the seeds of that kind of thinking germinating right now, coming to fruition. It is, in fact, the source of the anxiety that has led to Trump and Hillary and Bernie gaining the support that they have in this current political race in the United States. People are afraid for the future, and this is driving many of their most important decisions. So Star Trek has long been concerned with the future of the state. Culture, maybe a little bit less so, as you postulated, it might be a kind of wish fulfillment, and it might be a little bit more than just wish fulfillment. But some of the other texts that you mentioned are very, very much concerned with the future of the state.
Before we get there, there is one thing I want to talk about with culture. One more thing. Speaking of that fourth guiding star, the future of the state. So essentially what we have in culture is a series of benevolent dictatorships. Hubs, planets, ships that are run by minds. Very, very smart artificial intelligences that essentially provide for everything that the other beings under their care need. They anticipate, they respond, they provide, they care. And yet, you don't elect a mind. There's no democracy surrounding how a mind comes to power. A mind just assumes power. A mind is in control. We don't ever, to my knowledge, at least as far as I remember, we don't ever see that kind of speculation on how a mind comes to control a hub or how a mind comes to be in charge of a ship generally. And by that I mean, minds can move from ship to ship, and we see different ships communicating and interacting and whatnot throughout the course of the Culture series. But I mentioned this as a corollary to the future of the state because I know for a lot of readers of science fiction, and I don't want to say all, but that sort of complete control is something that I think necessarily goes hand in hand with a full-on utopian system. Because it...
Does it really, though? I mean, up here and I'm speaking as someone who lives in rural Montana, that would be something to fear, not to embrace. Control, machines taking over functions for humans, machines with superlatively fantastic reconnaissance and monitoring skills, the ability to eavesdrop on humans and make decisions for them without their consent. I think that to view that as specifically utopian is to read your own perhaps position on technology into it. Whereas I think what's great about culture is that you can impose your own perspective on that future as portrayed without coming away feeling like Ian M. Banks himself is saying this is like a positive portrayal of the future or a negative portrayal of the future. It's a portrayal of the future, and you can read yourself into it, and that's masterful in its own way.
Yeah, I don't want to say that the utopian lack of control is the only thing that you can read in culture, because that's certainly not true. But as far as extrapolating the sort of artificial intelligences that he posits, the sort of technological advances that he posits, the sort of utopian society that he posits, I feel like all of those things come together in a way that if we think about it in terms of those politics of governance, that those benevolent dictatorships, that complete lack of control in both the government system itself and infrastructural support, it looks really awesome in the books, but if you think about it that way and you're not willing to accept it on those terms, it can be very
devastating, devilish, diabolical, disconcerting.
Yes, that's it. It can be very disconcerting.
Okay, but if we're on the topic of future of the state and we're talking about utopian versus dystopian systems of government and their role in the future of the state, let's talk a little bit about the fifth season, because I don't know much about it, and yeah. I hear from reputable sources that it involves self-government by the oppressed, which I find Super interesting. So tell me a little bit about this world and how its system of government plays out.
Yeah.
In connection to Future of the State.
So I will issue a caveat here, which is that I am not completely finished with this book yet. I have been reading it devotedly because I like the characters so much, I like the story so much. But essentially why I wanted to pick this book is that what N.K. Jemisin does is she introduces us to this fantasy world called the Stillness, or rather, the Stillness is one continent in this fantasy world. I won't go too much into the book itself because we could spend far more than one podcast just taking apart this book. So,
and maybe we will.
We will definitely do that in the future. However, I picked it tonight because what I find interesting about this book with respect to the politics of governance is that there's a group of folks within this book called Orogenes, or that's Orogenes, Orogenes, like Oro sourced from the same root that means mountain or mountainous. But the important thing here is that the Orogenes, or as they are referred to derogatively, Ragas, have their own system of governance, both self-imposed and imposed upon them. They have this mini-government system called the Fulcrum, in which they train young Orogenes to become a part of their society. They assign them roles, they assign them mentors. Young Orogenes are assigned as apprentices. You have this whole society within a society. However, that society is both subservient to itself and to the larger society because these Orogenes are in turn policed by the larger society, by individuals known as guardians. So what's
fascinating.
What's interesting about this book to me with respect to the specific topic tonight is just that you have sort of this paper crane system of governance where you have this Russian nesting doll system of governance where you have the larger system in which the Orogenes and non-Orogenes exist, but then within that you have Orogenes both enacting a system of not just governance, but of restrictive self-governance, but also they're subject to that larger governance, and also their smaller governance had been put in place by folks who weren't them, but were, perpetuated by them. Like I said, I haven't gotten to the end of the book yet. I'm probably leaving out some really crucial details, but even about 2/3 of the way through, this book is so fascinating in the way it treats everything it touches that I really wanted to talk about it at least a little bit.
No, I'm really glad you brought that up, in part because even though that book is ostensibly set in an alternate universe or a future, I haven't read it, so I don't know which, even though it's set in that environment, it actually has more resonance with certain elements of the historical past on Earth than it does with some disembodied future state like we get in a lot of science fiction. I'm thinking specifically of like medieval guilds and things like that, where you had a miniature self-sustaining governance going on, where you did have apprentices trained and appointed and dispensed and so on and so forth, inside the larger culture of, the feudal society in which they lived. So, yeah, I think that's fascinating. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and I think, speaking again of your guiding stars, if we can return to the first two, borders and identities,
sure, yeah.
The political system of the Orogenes in the 5th season, I think, has really interesting things to say about both borders and identities. Borders not necessarily that are based in political lines on a map, but rather who is allowed to come in, who is allowed to be out, both that they self-imposed and that has been imposed upon them by society at large, by the guardians who accompany them, etc., etc. And also, identity is a super important thing. Origins are, as far as I can tell, as far into the book as I am, are born to non-origins as well as to origins. So coming into that origin identity is both something that's fraught with difficulty because you have, similarly to how you see in superhero identity stories, maybe they discover their power by hurting a friend accidentally or deploying it in a public place that they shouldn't. You have some of those stories, but the consequences are greater. There's more that happens. The origins take their power from the kinetic energy around them, or they transform energy that's around them, so they might kill someone doing that, or they chill the air around them, so that some sort of power is happening. So the acceptance and the coming into the origin identity is, that first time, very fraught. Continually a process of reproduction and reproduction as they meet a guardian, meet more origins, are indoctrinated and inducted into origin society, both as governing themselves and governed from the outside. So it's all fascinating. I could talk about it at length.
Well, I'm now piqued enough in my interest that I might go ahead and pick that up once November and NaNoWriMo is over. But something that you said really interested me, in that when you talk about identity as portrayed in the origins in the 5th season, what I keep hearing is mutants in the X-Men. Mm-hmm. Comics and television and movies. The assumption there is that power costs and power is uncomfortable and it manifests in very problematic ways. And tied to that identity is the notion of othering. Yeah. Of displacing whoever has that power from whoever doesn't have that power, which creates a border, right? So in that way, borders and identity are really, really bound up together. And I see that done beautifully in X-Men. And now I'm really excited to read the 5th season because it sounds like a fantastic thought experiment in othering and in self-identification. Creating boundaries between people, boundaries that maybe are inevitable, maybe aren't inevitable. Maybe that's the question of the text. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about borders and identities. Yeah. And maybe let's bring in some of the texts that we haven't talked about much yet. We haven't talked about, some of the more fantastical books on our list. We haven't talked about His Dark Materials, and we haven't talked about The Old Kingdom. Now, those who I'm familiar with, Alif the Unseen, I have no idea what happens in it. So, go ahead and stop me if you see somewhere where that's applicable.
I will.
But thinking about borders and identities, I just started Sabriel by Garth Nix, which is the first book, I believe, in the Old Kingdom series, even though there's time shifts and things that happen between books. You maybe leap backward a generation or so. And I'm fascinated with boundaries as made physical and literary in this text. So there's literally a wall dividing two worlds.
Yes.
And no, it's not like the wall in the north in Game of Thrones. This is a wall that literally separates two parallel worlds, two parallel universes. And already I've come across several references to cracks in the space-time continuum. And my understanding is that I don't quite get what decade it is on the normal human side of the wall, but on the other side, it's a magical universe. On the human side, some of that magic can leak in for a 50-mile radius around the border, but apart from that, it's, a very typical non-magical world. And technology doesn't work on the magical side of the wall, just like magic doesn't work on the technology side of the wall. Yep. So I don't know what decade it's at, if they even reference that on the technology side of the wall, but I could see that as today. I could see the world that Sabriel leaves as being the world of today, or maybe the world of the 70s, or maybe the world of the 40s. But I wanted to hear what you had to say about borders manifesting in His Dark Materials, because you're way more literate in His Dark Materials and that whole trilogy than I am. I have read it, but I see it as a very fluid universe where borders are constantly transgressed. And I know you have thoughts about that. So
yeah, well, let me actually start with the Old Kingdom, because part of what really works in the Old Kingdom books, and what I've always found fascinating, is the charter.
The charter magic.
Yes, so the charter in the Old Kingdom allows magic within the Old Kingdom, the country or the political organization or just the land that you find in the first 4 books is north of the Wall. So south of the Wall, we have the nation Ancestier, which is, you're right, it's a little sort of like, what year is it down there? I think it's anywhere from like late 1800s to maybe like middle of the 1900s. We're not going any further than that, but they do have cars, they have machine guns, they have recognizable garden parties. And then in the 5th book of the Old Kingdom, Golden Hand, which actually just came out about a month ago in early October 2016, we see for the first time what's north of the Old Kingdom. And there also the charter stops. So the charter only defines the region that is the Old Kingdom. So south it stops at the Wall, north it stops at something called the Great Rift. And so in that way, we start out in Sabriel and then in Lyriel, even in Abhorsen to some degree, seeing the charter as defining very rigidly what those borders of the political entity that is the Old Kingdom is. But then it starts to fall apart a little bit. We get a short story, Nicholas and the Creature in the Case, that actually shows charter magic working deep, deep, deep in Ancestier for reasons that the short story goes into. In Abhorsen, we see, again, the Wall transgressed, the border crossed, this old being of free magic, making it so that the Wall doesn't really matter anymore. There's magic across the Wall again. In Golden Hand, we leave the border that's in the south and head for the border that's in the north and cross that in all these different ways. So what's so interesting about the Old Kingdom series is that Garth Nix sets up this system of magical borders that you cannot cross, characters cannot cross, but then spends the rest of the series transgressing them.
Right, they exist to be crossed in a sense, literally, like for plot reasons, if nothing else. Do you think that that's perhaps making literal something that is not literal, but that is subversively present in a lot of other science fiction? What do you think about like transgression of boundaries as something that sci-fi does?
Well, I think that's an excellent segue to talk about His Dark Materials, which is sort of sidestepping your question about science fiction, but thinking about speculative fiction more generally. What His Dark Materials does, and it's less obvious, I think, in The Golden Compass or Northern Lights for those of you, I should say, because I have a copy of The Golden Compass, but Northern Lights for those of you who do not have the American version of this series.
You poor British sob.
But His Dark Materials is, again, all about transgressing not just borders, but universes. The actual walls that exist between universes. The second book, The Subtle Knife, is all about how can we cut into and slip through and experience these different realities. And then when we get to the Amber Spyglass, and we, have multiplied the realities that exist, have explored multiple universes, can cut through them so easily. Yeah, literally cut through them with the subtle knife. We see what happens, and it is that every time a cut is made, this demonic soul-sucking monster called a specter is created with every cut between universes. So it's a fascinating look at what happens when borders are crossed, in this case, borders between universes, that crossing does not come without a price. That for every crossing you make, there is a necessary consequence to that.
I hadn't really thought of it this way, but in that sense, His Dark Materials is a very conservative book.
It is.
It advocates
in
for
that way.
restraint over progress, in a sense.
Yes. And what I think it is I think it is conservative with that particular read. However, one of the ways that I also think that you can read it is against overexploitation. And we don't see in the series Will and Lyra doing this, but we hear that in the past, wielders of the subtle knife and other beings or folks who can move between universes have done so with abandon or without thinking about what the consequences are. So
I have one objection to how the specters are handled in the text.
yes.
Apart from it being needlessly conservative.
Yes.
I think the specters exist to make the children go back to their original universes and their original their starting points, plot-wise, because ultimately the angels and various other creatures of higher orders are basically tasked with taking care of the specters. And when the children ask them, oh, what happens to the specters? What are you going to do with them? They say, oh, we'll just take care of them. So the cost doesn't feel real in that sense. It feels like manufactured and only applicable when, the children need to be moved from point A to point B.
Yes.
Sometimes mechanically, sometimes emotionally. Now, I'm very, very grateful that Pullman didn't leave them snogging in the grass forever, because they spend way too much time oozing into each other's embraces towards the end. That was sickening for me. But I think there's something to be said for moments in these texts which are ostensibly advocating transgressive behaviors, transgressive notions of politics, transgressive notions of identity and governance and future state, etc. I think there's something to be said for the fact that when that breaks down, when the author fails to capture their actual vision, it can be a real disappointment. And let's be honest and let's be fair that His Dark Materials, the very last 50 or so pages, were a disappointment for me because they didn't make good on the transgressive promise of the first however many 600 pages. I don't know.
Yeah, and to be fair, once you kill God, it seems like it's kind of all downhill from there. Like, it's difficult to top that.
Only if you're a Christian.
Yeah, true. But I see what you're saying, and part of the reason why I think, looking back on His Dark Materials as a series, if we're thinking about it in terms, again, of the novum, so what's new, what's interesting, what's the central idea, or what are the central new ideas of what's going on here, the idea that that Paradise Lost could be retold, that this book could, take Judeo-Christian mythology, basically recast it, tell that story over again in this, on this hugely operatic scale that takes no less than the multiverse, all these different universes as its backdrop. And then by the third book, you have the characters not kill God, that was too glib, obviously, but release the angel who is identified as the closest thing to God from his prison to disperse into nothingness. Right. That's pretty damn transgressive. And I see what you're saying about that.
Yeah, but that happens like 50 pages before the end.
Oh, I think
that's not the end of the book.
No, it definitely isn't. And it's hard to follow up with that. However, the other thing that was really important to me as a young person reading His Dark Materials is the way that it's personally transgressive. And to see the coming into themselves as romantic sexual beings for Lyra and for Will seemed actually as important in the context of these books as the destruction of the kingdom of heaven. And that's kind of not an easy thing to do. And that feels very transgressive, to make the intimately personal be on the same scale as the grandly operatic that Philip Pullman does here.
I think I wanted to shift gears a little bit, though, as we kind of coast into the last section of this podcast. We haven't talked about a leaf yet, and we haven't talked about G. Willow Wilson. Mm-hmm. My exposure to G. Willow Wilson, if we're going to talk about transgressive sci-fi and, really creative approaches to the form, my exposure to her is Miss Marvel, specifically with Kamala Khan. And by the way, if you haven't read this wonderful comic, it is absolutely splendid. It's amazing. It's the most compassionate comic that I've read in a really long time. It has a really beautiful art direction as well. So if you're interested in comics and you're interested in picking up something new and you don't know where to go and you don't mind superhero comics, this would be a good one to pick up. But what happens in a leaf? And if we could use it as the center point for closing up our discussion of politics in science fiction, what does a leaf have to say that we haven't heard yet in this podcast?
Yeah, so in a sentence or less, A Leaf the Unseen is fantastical beings and computer technology.
Ooh.
And I will not say anything more because it is so much more than that. But I'm generally not someone who cares about spoiler alerts. This is a book that's been out for years and years. I would have no problem telling you exactly what the plot is. However, the experience of coming to this book and reading a fantastical work, a modern fantastical work that's set in the Middle East and doesn't take that setting for granted, but really digs into it, was so unique to me when I picked it up for the first time that I really encourage everyone who's listening to have that same experience. This is a fantastic book. Can't recommend it enough. However, I chose it because of all of the books on this list. It really engages with current systems of politics, current systems of governance, and, obviously pushes it into the speculative mode. We have those fantastical creatures at the same time that we have modern computer systems. However, it does so while presenting the world more or less as it is today. G. Willow Wilson takes as her setting the modern Middle East and goes from there, runs with it from there.
Well, I think that's a really interesting sort of off-ramp for this podcast, in that so many times I'm struck by sci-fi's problems with aging. I don't know how to verbalize that better, but a lot of the appeal of science fiction is in its timeliness, in its ability to comment on the world that created it as much as it comments on the worlds which it portrays. And I think that's one of the most possibly transgressive, in a really good way, elements of science fiction, one of its greatest weapons in its entire arsenal. And I think that it really speaks to science fiction's power to be both reflective of its world and transformative of its world. It shows within itself transformation, but it also has the ability to act upon the people who are reading it, or watching it or absorbing it. And I think all the texts that we've talked about here today, or most of the texts, I should say, sometimes we've referenced others that were not our primary six, but all of the texts we've referenced today, they're exploratory, they're transformative, they're transforming, they're doing all of this good hard work to some capacity. Maybe they don't all touch on all four of those guiding stars, which were borders, identity, governance, and the future of the state. Maybe they don't all spend the same amount of time focusing on all four of those points, but they do touch upon them at some point. And I think even more to their credit and to your credit in selecting them, I think that they really, they engage with, here's a quote from China Mieville. I don't know if you're familiar with him as an author. He's written some books which are seeing a lot of current interest.
Yes.
He's been around for about 15 years or maybe even more at this point. But he says, I don't think there's any contradiction between being a radical and being courteous, except with outright enemies. And he was speaking specifically in reference to his own atheism and how that interacts with his role as a writer. But I think all of these texts are courteous to the worlds which created them, to the worlds which they portray. They're radical, though. They're transgressive. They do a lot of really interesting work in calling our understandings of these four guiding stars, calling them into question, asking us to reevaluate our relationship to those four things in the present as readers. And I think that's what makes science fiction the perfect avenue to discuss what's happening in politics today, in America or otherwise. Mm-hmm. I mean, how better to talk about Donald Trump than to bring Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy into play and to talk about, what's the president's name?
Zaphod Beeblebrox.
Zaphod Beeblebrox. Like, I feel like he and Donald Trump need to be in the same sentence all the time. Or maybe not all the time, but, they can enrich our understanding, these texts of the world. They can allow us an alternate vocabulary that is perhaps less riddled with ill feeling. I mean, that's what we're struggling with in America today right now, is the inability to talk to each other about these things we care deeply about, because the language and the vocabulary itself of modern day politics is so fraught. But science fiction gives us another way in, and I just really respect that. Mm-hmm. And I specifically respect how that truth manifests itself in the text that you've pulled out for us today. So thank you for those texts, Tony. Did you have any final thoughts for us before we close out the podcast?
I want to finish with, since you quoted China Miéville, I want to follow that with a quote from a piece that he wrote and edited, or a piece that he wrote in a volume that he also co-edited called Historical Materialism, Research in Critical Marxist Theory. And if that sounds like far too much for this podcast, I will only say this single quote. So from this piece written in 2002, he said, "We need fantasy to think the world and to change it."
There is literally no better way to end this podcast, so there you have it.
There it is.